Today we have a very special guest, Eugenia Larmore, and of course, Dr. Tom Harris. Actually, it's Dr. Eugenia Larmore. Tom, you want to give a brief introduction?
Sure. Yes, Eugenia got her doctorate under me. She runs a consulting firm that one of her things she did was develop a forward forecasting model for the Reno-Sparks SMSA. What we have here, this is something where you got funding. I'm running a University Center for Economic Development funded by EDA, and what we wanted to do is present information to people with this since the COVID-19. One of the areas we wanted to do is hopefully every quarter we can talk about the Reno-Sparks economy, what's going on, and what Eugenia sees, what has happened, what may go on in the future. So what we want to try to do is give timely information of the economic trends, of course, the impacts of the COVID-19, and maybe some other trends that are how we're coming out of this and future trends in that thing. So I will turn it over to Eugenia and let her do her presentation. Thank you for your time, Eugenia.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom mentioned, my name is Eugenia Larmore. I'm the president of Ekay Economic Consultants. We're based in Reno, and we specialize in feasibility and market, fiscal, economic impact, and various other economic studies. And so what I have today is a presentation on the impact of COVID-19. Really, we'll focus today on the Reno-Sparks economy. So I'll share my screen and then we'll go through the presentation.
Sounds good. Go right ahead.
So as Tom mentioned, we created a leading and coincidence index for the Reno-Sparks MSA, and taking a step back, Reno-Sparks MSA includes Washoe and Story counties, and the reason we like to use Washoe County as it's the home of Reno and Sparks, the biggest population centers outside of Las Vegas in the state, but we also like to include Story County. It is home to the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, which is a large employer in the area. So we like to include Story County to capture really the region-wide effect, especially as it pertains to employment. So here we have a leading and coincident indices for the Reno-Sparks MSA. And what we're trying to capture is coincident index really in our model here represents where the economy is today. And the leading index attempts to predict where the economy will be in the future, about 6 to 12 months out. As you can see, the changes in the leading index really precede the changes in the coincident index in this model. And the reason we have this here, this stops, and it's a monthly index series, and the reason we stopped this one in February of 2020, so pre-COVID. And what we want to see is what was happening to the Reno-Sparks economy before the pandemic hit. And what was happening is what we really have for a number of months have called increasing, or our economy was increasing at a decreasing rate. We're still had significant growth. Most of our indicators included in these indices were growing strongly, but a little bit at a slightly slower rate than it was post-recession, more sustainable, more a rate that everybody could be a little more comfortable with, not the significant growth what we had in the past, but still very positive. And so all of the indicators that are included in this series, employment, taxable, sales, gaming revenue, passenger and airport shipment numbers, were all growing. Things were going very steadily. Employment, which grew by 10%, 10,000 employees per year over the last 3 years, only grew by 5,000. Still a significant amount of growth, but really kind of a slower, allowing us to maybe catch up with the growth that we had in the preceding years. So things were looking up, wages were going up, unemployment in February was 3.4%, some of the lowest that we've had in the past. So very steady, and thoughts of recession were getting pushed back into late 2021 to early 2022. So steady times. What's interesting to see here, this is a growth share matrix that I learned from Dr. Harris during my PhD program at UNR, is this shows the concentration and the growth of certain industries. And this was part of an analysis we did as to, in looking in 2019, where was the region, and this is a Washoe County, Story line in Churchill County, so kind of the growth region surrounding Reno-Sparks, what industries were growing significantly. And what we saw was manufacturing and construction. We had high concentration in these industries in terms of employment, and we were seeing growth. So we were moving away from accommodation and food services, which has been really the lifeblood of this area in the past, and more towards manufacturing and construction. And as we'll talk later, this is really what has helped this region weather some of the pandemic impacts. So things were going great, and COVID hits. This is kind of a major timeline. There's been a million things that have happened regionally, nationally, but this really just focuses more on the business and the economic impacts. So March 18, we have the first run of the businesses getting closed. All of the non-essential businesses are required by the governor's office to close. We have some additional closures later in April for some outdoor facilities. And then we enter recovery phase 1. So May 9th, we opened some restaurants, salons, and some retail. Still minimizing things, 50% capacity. By the end of May, we moved into phase 2. So essentially for the biggest COVID impacts to date, the biggest months impacted were about mid-May through mid-March through most of May. Then we saw things were looking good, and then we started having a growth in cases. So the governor's office has closed some of the non-food serving bars and restaurants at first in multiple counties, then some of the counties were released from the closure. So this is kind of the timeline that we're really focusing on in this presentation. So what happened? That March to May impact, the biggest things were closed, non-essential businesses, most restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, and that impacted our leisure and hospitality industry. During that time, compared to the same period of the previous year, before obviously the pandemic impacts, we lost almost 11,000 jobs in the leisure and hospitality. The biggest impacted industry was leisure and hospitality. That includes your casinos, that includes food and beverage. So lots of people were impacted. And if you look at the wages for this industry, it has a median hourly wage of $12.80 compared to $24.66 as an average for the entire Reno-Sparks area. That is a significantly low wage industry. So not only was this industry impacted, these are low wage earners, so they were impacted disproportionately more than some of the higher wage industries. So that really the biggest impact of the pandemic in this region has been on that leisure and hospitality industry. We saw some transportation warehousing. We have to remember that includes railroad and airport transportation. Obviously, travel has been impacted significantly, both from the commercial and personal standpoints. And then, so overall, we lost about 20,000 jobs in the area during that period. What has happened to date is some of these industries has recovered. We're still about down, as of June, compared to June of last year, we're down about 15,000 jobs. So we're making headway, we're recovering, but there's still some of the industries are impacted significantly more than other industries. And again, accommodation and food services is the most impacted. Things like construction and retail trade have recovered their last year's employment numbers. So significant, they were impacted during the time, but not anymore. So they've recovered some of that. And again, that takes us to June. We're not seeing the impacts of some of the bar closures, and we're not seeing future impacts. So of course, unemployment, I just wanted to include this. We're hearing a lot about, Nevada is leading the nation in unemployment, and I just wanted to show the kind of the impact, the difference of unemployment rates between the state as a whole and the Las Vegas area and the Reno MSA. Part of what we talked about, the diversity of our industries has helped us weather the pandemic impacts a little bit better than the Las Vegas area that is still heavily dependent on visitors. And so this shows that in April, we hit a peak of 20.4% unemployment. We've reduced that by more than half, and we're at 8.6% by June. So I wanted to throw this, so we're not looking at this in the vacuum. These are employment and output multipliers, and this shows how $1 lost in the accommodation industry or one employee lost in the accommodation industry actually creates a loss of $1.74 or a loss of 1.55 employees throughout the region. And that's important to know. Just as these most impacted industries were suffering, industries providing services and benefiting from the spending by the impacted industries were also suffering. So accountants and lawyers and service industries and wholesalers providing goods and services to these industries also suffered. So not a vacuum and a big impact overall. So looking at some other economic indicators, taxable gaming revenue, casinos were closed. We're actually surprised there is actually some revenue in May 2020. Some of it is just due to the timing of the revenue collection. But if you look at the number, the farthest on the left, that was June 2019. In June 2020, we're only 8% below our previous year's amounts. And we like to compare it year to year to the same month to get rid of seasonality, because these are highly seasonable industries. But so we're only 8% below on the gaming revenue side. Things are returning there. Taxable sales, the June 2020 number is estimated using some historical data, but we're expecting, even the May numbers exceeded the previous year's May. June numbers are significantly expected to exceed the previous June numbers. So strong recovery in the taxable sales. And that's not to say that it's equal for all industries. This looks at all of the retail taxable sales between that March to May most impacted period. And it shows that not everybody suffered or benefited equally. Non-store retailers, of course, as you would expect, as most of us switched to online purchasing during this time, increased 155%. Building and materials, it felt like everybody was remodeling their houses during the time we were stuck in our houses. Those sales also increased, but some industries, more motor vehicles and food and services and drinking places, obviously were significantly impacted. And those are big drivers of taxable revenues in the area. The good news is we're recovering taxable sales in total, but we're not recovering them in the same in all of the industries. And of course, the Reno-Tahoe International Airport visitors and transportation, obviously cargo shipped, are important components of our economy. Transportation, manufacturing, warehousing is where a lot of our growth is occurring. We're significantly impacted during the pandemic, especially on the passenger side. We're seeing a little bit of a recovery. That's the blue line there. A little bit of a recovery, but nowhere near the levels we had today. And a lot of that is just basic nervousness about flying. And we're going to see a lot of that as this continues. And then visitor counts. Surprisingly high numbers in June 2020, all things considered, but still well below last year's levels. And then getting to housing. Interesting, in the housing department, so we're looking at second quarter numbers. So 3 months worth, latest 3 months worth of data. Single family housing has really been the standout. They increased both in the number of sales and in the prices. Prices overall for even existing and total single family housing increased in the region between the 2 quarters, but the number of existing single families sold declined, and a lot of that may be because of just hesitancy of people to list their homes in the first place. And we saw that if you look at the square below, where we're talking about just July numbers comparing to last year, home listings declined by 32%. So maybe not so comfortable listing your house, letting people walk through the house. If you don't absolutely have to move, maybe this is not the right time for people to do it. But sales are still increasing and home prices are increasing strongly. And what we're seeing for the housing industry is we're seeing a consumer preference for new homes. I think there's a little bit maybe of a health preference where you want to be the only person who's been in the house. The gap between the new and existing family homes is shrinking. So again, there's that preference for having a home that is maybe a little custom, made brand new to you. And there is a reduced existing family supply, but historically low interest rates are seem to be overcoming the reluctance to purchase and to enter the housing market. And so a lot more people are out there looking for housing if they can afford it and if they absolutely need to be purchasing. So that's the interest rates are definitely a driver. And again, with the growing prices, affordability is going to be an issue, and we really need to continue to look at this as a regional housing market, not just a Reno-Sparks housing market, with homes in Fernley and Dayton $100,000 to $150,000 less than they are in the Reno-Sparks area. So affordability is more of a localized issue than it is a region-wide issue. And so putting it all together, we started the presentation with this index series looking through February. This is bringing it through June. And what's happening, and what we can see in the little insert on the bottom right, is we are seeing what we're calling either a fat V or a skinny U recovery. Things are definitely looking up. The problem with this is that this is a very sensitive recovery. The closure of bars is not captured in here. Any further closures or second, third, however we're counting the waves of COVID, will impact this very sensitive recovery. But we are seeing some recovery in the area with the businesses being open. And I mean, this is very good news to see after months of declines. And so what's the outlook? This is not, we are in the recession. This is not an economic recession. Economic recessions, most recessions we know were caused by imbalance in the economy. Housing imbalance, finance. In this case, this is a medical recession. And so the resolution, there's very little we can do to solve this until there's a medical solution to the pandemic. So a vaccine, medical resolution, there's much we can do with public policy in the meantime to try to lessen the impacts, the rental moratoriums, unemployment payments. That certainly helps during the process, but the resolution will not come until we have a medical solution to this. And part of the problem is, even if a medical solution occurs, unless it is very finalized, it's going to be really hard to change people's minds and their nervousness about the situation. So there are some results of a recent survey. They're actually mid-August, so they just occurred a couple of days ago. It shows that more than half of our population is uncomfortable to going out to eat, going to shopping malls, vacations, movies, and gyms. That is the lifeblood of the economy. If people are not doing it, there's certainly spending online. There's certainly a lot of other ways to be spending, but we're going to need, at some point, we're going to need to overcome that reluctance to really return to the previous levels of growth. And government budget impacts. This is not, as we saw, taxable sales, gaming revenues are returning to their pre-COVID levels. In the Reno-Sparks area, they're not doing as well in the Las Vegas area, and that's going to impact our state revenues. And state revenues fund not only statewide services, but they also flow to our schools, into our roads, into the grants and other special programs for our local governments. So we're going to experience that locally, the budget cuts and the shortfalls with the state. And we're going to start looking into raising existing rates or new sources of revenues and obviously cutting expenditures. So we will feel that later on significantly as the budget fall and the shortfall continues. As we briefly discussed before, what really helps our region is that industry diversity. We have moved away from leisure and hospitality. We have moved to manufacturing, transportation, and warehousing. And not only is this industry, as we saw in that employment by industry loss chart, not only has that industry been not as severely impacted, it is potentially, there's discussion that it's going to now benefit from the shifts in operations as companies move their supply chains to on or near shoring, trying to make sure that your parts are not being made in China or somewhere across the world that may be interrupted by the next pandemic or political or social or any kind of changes. So that will create a lot more interest in producing and shipping and storing locally. And again, we, as with all the growth that we're experiencing in these industries, we should definitely benefit from that shift. And we're expecting continued population growth. We're going to be impacted by various markets with the baby boomers moving away. They're not tied to jobs. They're more concerned about investment and tax rates. Nevada has always been an attractive state. There's the expectation that this will continue to happen, but also as more and more workers are working remotely and realizing that they're not tied to their location of their business, they're going to start moving for just the quality of life issues. And obviously, as we all know, there's quite a bit of quality of life in this region. So we are expecting population growth to increase in the area, continue to increase in the area. But again, we really need to start looking at a regional approach to housing because this will start driving prices in the area. So tentatively, great news for the area so far. Following the months of declines, we're showing some recovery, but the recovery is very sensitive and will depend on the future of the pandemic and the governmental and the impacts and the policies that we continue to follow. And that's all I have.
Yeah, Eugenia, this is Tom. Let me ask a question. With the pandemic, I was on a broadband meeting earlier. The guy was bringing up in like I told you, in people who have jobs in the San Francisco area, many of the high tech. Some of the high tech people are giving people, they have to work at lower wages, but they have the opportunity to work away at home. I guess this is also something that's advantageous to us as long as our broadband is adequate and also cost, broadband costs too, we have to be aware. But the availability and cost efficiency of the broadband here in Reno, that's going to bring people over too, I think.
I absolutely agree. I think that's part of it. With people not being tied to their jobs, they'll be able to pick and choose where they can go. And Reno-Sparks, we're relatively developed. We have the broadband, we have the communication structures. I think it makes it very attractive for quite a few people because we are also close to the Bay Area. We're close to all the recreation. I think I'm a little biased, but this is a good place to be.
That's true. Also, I was going to say, if people look at some of the chart numbers, remember when they talk about education in hospitals, that's private education. Public education, like schools and universities, that will be in your government. And that's the next issue I think that we're worried about, I think mostly, is some of the public revenues that we've seen. We've had changes in we had those special sessions because the government, you saw the gaming revenue is very essential to our state. If we have some decreases in state government revenues and other things, that might be an impact that it's going to happen later too.
Absolutely. And locally, taxable sales taxes are about 30% of Reno and Sparks's general budgets, but our taxable sales were just not as significantly impacted because our taxable sales are primarily generated by locals, and they still have to purchase groceries. You're still eating out, you're still spending it locally. So we have not been significantly impacted the way the state and other governments may be.
Sure. I would say to everybody that we'll have a question thing. Even if you see this, you have some questions, send it this way. We'll get it out to Eugenia to ask you questions. I think it's very interesting what she had. You saw those graphs. We have gone through tremendous downturn. It's almost like it, and all of us have made changes. And then we're kind of coming up like a U. I think that's more of a thing, not that V-shaped thing. But Eugenia, you got anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just, it's good to have some good news, and I just hope it continues.
Me too. Well, that's it for now, but I'll turn it over to Bob.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, we've had, I don't know how many, Tom, maybe about 10 of these kinds of video discussions about what's happening during COVID. And I believe, Eugenia, yours is the first that, you know, explicitly said we have some, you know, defined good news on the horizon. So thank you for that.
Sure, always happy to make people happy.
It always, I think Eugenia is very true. This is not an ordinary recession. It's something we sometimes call administrative closures, and this disease dictates things. If we have to close things down again, but I don't know. I think we're weathering it. We'll see. But anyway, it is one of the first times that I think of many that we're going to see slowly coming out, which is very nice.
All right. I guess that's it. Thank you so much. And stay tuned. We'll be doing more.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.